Today I will discuss the evolution of the Quenya verbal system and how Tolkien's conception of language influenced the development of its verbal morphology. My interest in this topic originated from the connection between two fields that I have been central to my academic background, classical studies and Tolkien's linguistics. During my studies in classics, I became increasingly aware of the close relationship between language, thought, and culture. A language is not simply a tool of communication. It is a historical structure that reflects the experiences, categories, and intellectual development of the communities that use it. The study of ancient languages, especially Greek and Latin, shows clearly that grammatical systems are not fixed structures, but the result of historical processes. At the same time, my discovery of Tolkien's linguistic work revealed a particularly interesting example of this relationship. Tolkien's invented languages are not simply collections of words created for a fictional universe. They are linguistic systems constructed according to principles that are normally associated with natural languages. They possess internal structures, historical development, variation, relationships between languages, and processes of change. The aim of my presentation today, however, is not to provide a general discussion of Tolkien's linguistic thought. Rather, it focuses on a specific aspect of his linguistic creation, the evolution of the Quenya verbal system. The central question behind this study is therefore the following. How did the verbal system of Quenya develop through the years? And how was the evolution influenced by Tolkien's linguistic interests? To answer this question, I analyze a series of grammatical documents written by Tolkien throughout his life, examining how the organization of the Quenya tense-stem system changed over time, focusing in particular on the evolution of the future tense. To start my analysis, it is important to give a brief outline of the history of Quenya that help us to see the evolution with hypothetical distinctive moments. Four principal phases can be identified, preceded by an early formative period corresponding to Tolkien's first linguistic experiments between 1911 and 1915. The chronology of the phases is closely connected to significant periods in Tolkien's life and to the composition of specific language texts. The first phase extends from approximately 1915 to 1923. During this period, Tolkien composed the Quenya Quetzal, his first attempt at a grammatical description of Quenya, although the section devoted to verbs remained incomplete. Other important texts from this phase are Matar and Tulir and the Quenya verb forms, which represent the earliest attempts to organize the verbal system. In particular, the Quenya verb forms is significant because it represents the first verbal paradigm, distinguishing categories such as aorist, present, future, and past. Although the system is still simple and experimental, it already shows the idea that different verbal forms develop from a common verbal base. The second phase, covering approximately 1923-1930, represents a transitional stage towards a more systematic description of the language. The main text of this period is the early Quenya grammar, Tolkien's first complete grammatical description of Quenya. Here, the verbal system becomes more organized. Tolkien introduces clearer distinctions between different verb classes and provides a more detailed analysis of tense formation. This phase also includes the Quenya conjugations, a series of manuscripts written in the years he was a professor at Leeds, containing different versions of verbal paradigms. The three versions of the Quenya conjugations show his process of development. The first is the most experimental, with 8 tense and mood distinctions, while the latter two present a more developed system with 10 distinctions. The third phase, from around 1930 to 1949, corresponds to the major period of Quenya, The most important document is the Quenya verb structure, composed around 1940, which represents Tolkien's most complete analysis of the verbal system. In this text, verbs are no longer treated simply as a collection of forms, but as part of a historical and structural system. Tolkien analyzes Quenya in relation to earlier stages of Elvish, especially Common and Dain, and explains the organization of verbs through a series of principal stems associated with specific temporal and aspectual values. Related documents such as AVS1 and AVS2, AVS stands for Eldarin Verbal Structure, provide a historical and comparative framework, explaining the development of Quenya verbal structure from earliest stages of the Elvish languages. The fourth and final phase begins after the publication of The Lord of the Rings and contains the largest amount of linguistic material. The main grammatical source for this period is the late notes on verb structure, written between 1969 and 1970. Although these notes do not constitute a complete grammar, they are extremely valuable because they reveal Tolkien's final reflections and revisions on Quenya morphology, showing that the verbal system continued to be reconsidered throughout his later years. This evolution, therefore, shows a gradual transition from Tolkien's earlier experiments with Quenya as a creative language through increasingly systematic grammatical descriptions to a meta-linguistic model in which the verbal system is analyzed both synchronically and historically. Now we are going to see how the verbal stem system evolves through the years. It is important to start by highlighting that each verbal system has a different organization and that the notion of verbal stem is not the basic idea of all of them. Having a verbal system based on stems, meaning having a system that gives tense the major role in grammar, from which all the other information starts. For Tolkien's Quenya, this has clearly been the idea from the beginning of his language creation, but the organization of these tense stems and their meaning in the general system changed through the years together with this conception of language. Let's start with the earliest texts, which do not mention tense stems explicitly, but can be interpreted by comparison with the other forms as the conjugation of the present stems of two verbs, matar, to eat, and tulir, to come. Some of these endings will later reappear in Tolkien's grammatical texts. As can be seen, the two verbs have different stem vowels, a for matar and I for tulir, which might suggest that in Tolkien's conception they belong to different verb classes, as occurs, for example, in the first conjugation of Latin, where vowels distinguish conjugation classes. However, the conjugation of matar and tulir is presented without context or explanation by the author, which is why we cannot be certain about about what these forms represent. The concept of tense stems, as later developed by Tolkien, is not yet presented here, since vowels will later come to mark tense distinctions. The second text of the same early phase is Quenya verb forms, in which the idea of tense stems begin to emerge. It is not a full grammar, as there is very little explanation, and the footnotes document all the changes that Tolkien made over the years. 4 categories are introduced: present, future, past, and aorist. Here we can already observe suffixes that will, in various forms, remain in Tolkien's system until the end, such as the va suffix for the future, ie for the past tenses, although it will later become the marker of the perfect, and alternation between I and a in the present, which introduces the later distinction between aorist I and present a. This document is particularly important because it is the first known text in which Tolkien explicitly outlines how the tense system should be organized. At the beginning of the second phase, we find the first full grammar in which Tolkien provides detailed explanation. Here there is a shift in his conception of the language. Instead of organizing it into four tense stems, he reduces the system to three, while largely retaining the same suffixes. There is no reference to the aorist in this grammar, and Tolkien appears to recognize the system according to the simplest possible temporal distinction, reference to what is past, what is present, and what is future. There is yet no dedicated study on this development, but Tolkien's interest in Esperanto during this period may be relevant, and it is a language designed for universal communication and structured in a highly intuitive way. In the same phase, Quenya conjugation reveals Tolkien's ongoing experimentation with verbal structure. He explores alternative possibilities, including the idea of a morphologically distinct subjunctive, although he generally prefers to express mood through particles rather than verbal endings. The earliest version is the most different from the later ones, as it contains 8 tense mood distinctions instead of 10. Even in the first system, the innovations are numerous. Tenses are conceived in pairs sharing the same stem but distinguished by different endings, namely present endings and past or subjunctive endings. As can be seen, present and aorist derive from the same stem. The former takes present endings, while the latter takes past endings. The second pair consists of past and perfect, based on the ES stem, where the first expresses the past and the second the perfect. The third pair consists of future and conditional. The former takes present endings, while the latter takes past endings. The final pair is different, as the similarity lies not in the endings but in the stem. Both use subjunctive endings identical to the past endings. The distinction is instead marked by the stem, the present subjunctive as ia, while the past subjunctive as ia. The second and third version of Quenya conjugation remain stable in terms of the number of tense mood distinction, but differ in their representation. The system becomes more differentiated with the appearance of the imperative and a more clearly defined subjunctive, now specified as the aorist subjunctive. The same distinctions are preserved in these later versions, which share the vowel a but differ in their endings. The subjunctive uses past or subjunctive endings, while the imperative, except for the first and the second person, employs distinct endings. At this stage, the system is based on stems to which endings are added in order to express temporal meaning. It is therefore not yet an aspectual system, as it will become in the next phase. The idea of parallel stems combined with primary and secondary endings, together with the introduction of subjunctive, is reminiscent of ancient Greek. The most mature and systematic description of the Quenya verbal system is found in Quenya verb structure. Here it is particularly noteworthy that the structure of the verbal system is explicitly derived from Common Eldarin, showing how it is becoming increasingly organized and coherent from a historical perspective. The link with comparative philology and the Indo-European system is now made explicit. The division into 5 stems and their derivation from Common Eldarin is clearly presented. Here there are 5 stems with different suffixes rather than endings. In addition to these stems, there is also a repetitive stems, which, although explained as part of the present stem, function as an additional stem. When combined with present, past, and future suffixes, it produces repetitive forms across all the tenses, expressing an action in progress or repetition. This development reflects Tolkien's broader linguistic philosophy. A language should not simply consist of forms, but of a historical system explaining why those forms exist and how they are interconnected. Among the verbal categories of Quenya, the future tense offers a particularly revealing case study for understanding how Tolkien's morphological system develops over time. What is especially significant is that across the different stages of Quenya's evolution, the formal marker of the Quenya remain relatively stable. The suffix va, later extended to uva, is consistently present from early Quenya forms through the Quenya verb structure. At first sight, this might suggest continuity in both form and function. However, a closer examination shows that what changes is not the morphological shape of the future, but its grammatical interpretation. In Quenya verb forms, the future suffix is already va, but Tolkien adds an important specification. He says, ending of future is uva in many verbs. Ta derivatives and long stem consonant verbs, as osta, ostuva, carpi, carpuva. This note is significant because it shows that extension with u was already present in his thinking at this stage. In the early Quenya grammar, the suffix uva becomes clearly established as the marker of future reference. The future stem is obtained by the suffix uva. It is also integrated into more complex formations such as future imperfect tu lingua, future perfect tu lingua, and other extended verbal forms. At this stage, however, the system remains relatively unstable, and future meaning is still partially distributed across periphrastic constructions. The suffix uva continues to function as a marker of both future and conditional in the Quenya conjugation. A more systematic reorganization appears in Quenya verb structure, where the future is fully integrated into a historical grounded system derived from common Eldarin. Here, Tolkien explicitly reconstructed its origin. In AVS, the future suffix is analyzed as ba, in Quenya va, often preceded by u. He further suggests a verbal origin meaning go, precede. So, karuva will make, originally was, is proceeding to. He also proposes a phonetic motivation for u, explaining it as euphonic, since uva naturally develops in verbs with a u element, and notes that in some cases u may also carry a sense of inception or imminence. In AVS2, however, the interpretation changes significantly. Here, the future is derived from a different root, ub, with a meaning related to intention. As Tolkien himself said, the suffix in this case was uva, and the u had no connection with the u vowel seen after the stem in a number of old verbs. Early formations such as matubani are interpreted as meaning I intend to eat. Finally, in late notes on verbal structure, Tolkien returns again to a different derivation. Here the future is still based on uva, but with meaning of imminence. As Tolkien himself said, Quenya developed a pure future of fact or eventually, with a stem uva suffixed to the bare stem. This base ub provided a verbal stem uva in original sense, impend, be imminent, approach, draw near. From these, forms like karuba originally express to be about to, which later generalizes into a simple future meaning. What emerges from this comparison is not a linear development of a tense form, but a process of semantic reinterpretation. The morphological marker remains relatively stable, while its grammatical function is repeatedly reanalyzed within the system. In this sense, the future tense is a clear example of how Quenya evolves not simply through the creation of forms, but through the reinterpretation of existing ones within an increasingly complex verbal architecture. After analyzing the historical development of the Quenya verbal system, it is now possible to consider a broad question. Which linguistic tradition contributed to the formation of this system, And how did Tolkien transform these influences into a coherent linguistic structure? Let's start from what Tolkien himself said about this topic. Two of the Elvish tongues appear in this book. They have some sort of existence, since I have composed them in some completeness, as well as their history and account of their relationship. They are intended to be definitely of a Indo-European kind in style and structure, not in detail, and to be simple and to be specially pleasant. The former is not difficult to achieve, but the latter is more difficult, since individuals' personal predilection, especially in the phonetic structure of languages, varies widely, even when modified by the imposed languages, including their so-called native tongue. I have therefore pleased myself. The archaic language of lore is meant to be a kind of Elven Latin, and by transcribing it into a spelling closely resembling that of Latin, except that E is only used as a consonant as E in English yes, the similarity to Latin has been increased ocularly. Actually, it might be said to be composed on a Latin basis with two other main ingredients that happen to give me phonesthetic pleasure, Finnish and Greek. It is, however, less consonantal than any of the three. In letter 144, Tolkien described Quenya as a language conceived accordingly to a broadly Indo-European style and structure. He referred to it as an Elven Latin and explained that its phonetic character had been shaped by the combination of different linguistic elements, especially Latin, Greek, and Finnish. However, these statements should not be interpreted as meaning that Quenya was directly derived from any of these languages. Rather, Tolkien's linguistic creation emerged from the interaction between different traditions, selected and reorganized according to his own aesthetic and philological principles. In my research, after watching at the evolution of the verbal system, I tried to find out in a specific way how the languages that Tolkien knew helped in creating Quenya. The aim of this final part is not to identify a single source language for Quenya, but to examine how different linguistic influences contributed to specific aspects of its verbal system. The first important influence to consider is Finnish. Finnish occupies a special position in Tolkien's linguistic imagination because, as he himself recalled, the discovery of Finnish grammar during these years at Exeter College represented one of the most important moments in his development as a language creator. Tolkien described this experience as discovering a complete wine cellar filled with bottles of an amazing wine of kind and flavor never tasted before, explaining that his invented languages became heavily Finnicized in phonetic pattern and structure. This influence should not be understood as a different imitation of Finnish, but rather as a selective adoption of features that matched Tolkien's linguistic preferences. While previous studies have mainly focused on Finnish phonological influence on the creation of Quenya, this aspect is not relevant to the present research, which concentrates instead on the verbal system and its morphology. Within this domain, I found evidence of a more substantial influence, the possible adoption of negative verb within the verbal system, a feature not typically associated with Indo-European languages, as well as the suggestion proposed by some scholars that the future marker va, later expanded in uva, may also reflect a Finnish model. A particularly significant case, however, is the verb tule, to come. As discussed previously, this is one of the earliest attested verbal forms in Quenya. The form appears strictly similarly both in shape and meaning to the Finnish verb tule as presented in the grammar encountered by Tolkien in Eliot's Finnish grammar. On the slide, the relevant passage from this grammar shows the form through which Tolkien likely encountered the verb. The identity of form and meaning is particularly noteworthy. Tolkien may have been strongly influenced by this verb and subsequently adopted it as a model in his earliest grammatical sketches, where it functions as a basic example for verbal conjugation. The importance of this parallel does not lie merely in formal resemblance, but in its position within the earliest stages of Quenya development. The presence of this verb in Tolkien's first grammatical materials suggests that Finnish influence may have operated not only at the level of general phonological inspiration, but also through specific lexical items that were directly integrated into the foundational structure of the language, functioning in a way comparable to a loan word or a borrowed lexical element from another language. The most significant characteristic of the mature Quenya verbal system is the central role assigned to verbal stems. This aspect can be better understood in light of a fundamental principle of Indo-European comparative linguistics, as illustrated in the quotation on the slide. In PNEA, verbal roots canonically form three morphologically distinct verbal stems, traditionally and here referred to as present, aorist, and perfect. This tripartite distinction is maintained only in Indo-Iranian and Greek. It is widely thought that the three stems express primarily differences of grammatical aspects. As the first posted states, Proto-Indo-European verbal roots are generally reconstructed as forming three morphological distinct stems, traditionally referred to as present, aorist, and perfect. This tripartite distinction is only fully preserved into Indo-Iranian and Greek, and it is widely accepted that these stems primarily encode a spectral rather than temporal distinctions. The present expressing an ongoing or internally structured action, the aorist a complete whole, and the perfect a resulting state. This is particularly evident in Tolkien's treatment of the opposition between present and aorist. The distinction is not based simply on past or present time, but on the way in which an action is conceived. The present expresses an action viewed as continuous, while the aorist represents the action without the limitation of duration. The second quotation further refines this picture by addressing the status of the future. The reconstruction of a future Indo-European as a morphologically distinct inflectional category of the verb is controversial. Futurity could be expressed by the present indicative stems with or without an adverb indicating the future. A desiderative suffix, meaning wanted to do, comes to mark the future in a number of daughter languages. This suffix appears to be composed on the thematic vowel combined with a desiderative morpheme, as reflected directly in Greek, indirectly elsewhere, for instance in the Celtic feature descended from derivatives. The reconstruction of a morphological distinct future tense is considered controversial for Proto-Indo-European. Instead, futurity could be expressed by the present indicative, sometimes accompanied by adverbial specification. In addition, desiderative formation developed into future markers in several daughter languages, as seen directly in Greek and other languages. A similar tendency can be observed in the evolution of Quenya. In the earliest grammatical texts, Tolkien's system is still mainly organized around tense categories. However, through successive revisions, verbal stems become increasingly important until the mature Quenya verb structure presents a system organized around a series of principal stems. In this final stage, Quenya distinguishes between present, aorist, perfect, past, and future stems. Although this system does not reproduce Proto-Indo-European morphology, it reflects a similar conception of verbal organization. The stem becomes the fundamental element from which different grammatical meanings are developed. Ancient Greek, therefore, occupies a particularly important position among Tolkien's linguistic influences. While Indo-European comparative linguistics provide a broader theoretical framework, Greek offered a concrete and highly influential way of conceptualizing verbal aspects within a fully developed morphological system. This becomes particularly clear when we consider Tolkien's own analysis of Quenya verbal distinction. In explaining the differences between sile shines and sila is shining, Tolkien explicitly refers to the Greek grammatical concept of the aorist. As the quotation on the slide clarifies, the term aorist is taken from Greek grammar, where it designates a past tense form characterized by the absence of limitation of completion or continuance. It is precisely this notion that is used to frame the Quenya distinction between the stem sil, as seen in the aorist present sile shines, and the form with lengthened vowel sil, as seen in the continuative present sila is shining. This comparison is important because it shows that Tolkien did not simply borrow terminology from classical grammar, but adopted a Greek derivative conceptual framework for analyzing verbal meaning, in which aspectual distinctions are centered. The influence of Greek can also be observed in Tolkien's treatment of non-infinitive verbal categories, especially participles and infinitival formations. These forms, which occupy an intermediate position between verbal and nominal morphology, are typically of many ancient Indo-European languages and play an important role in Quenya as well. However, Greek should not be considered a direct structural model for Quenya. Tolkien did not attempt to replicate Greek grammar. Rather, Greek functioned as an interpretive key through which he conceptualized and systematized aspects of his own linguistic creation. Latin occupies a somewhat different position within this comparative framework. While Tolkien famously referred to Quenya as an Elven Latin, this comparison should not be understood primarily in grammatical terms. Rather, Latin's relevance lies on a different level, connected to cultural status, literary tradition, and linguistic prestige. This is made particularly explicit in the quotation on the slide, where Elfin explains that Quenya is transcribed using Latin spelling and pronunciation as a reference point, and explicitly describes it as the Latin of the elves, though it be of greater reverence and age than even the language of Rome or any other tongue among mortal men. What is particularly significant here is not only the cultural comparison, but also the practical choice of using Latin orthography as the model for representing Quenya. This orthographic decision has important consequences for modern readers, because Quenya is written using a Latin-based spelling system. It is visually and phonetically more accessible to readers familiar with Romance or Latin-based orthographies. For instance, for a reader whose native language is Italian, the visual decoding of Quenya tends to be more immediate than for speakers of languages with less transparent orthographic systems, such as English. Ryan always asked me to say Parma and Dalamberon for this reason. Within the internal world of Middle-earth, Quenya functions as a language of lore, poetry, ceremony, and historical memory. In this sense, it occupies a role comparable to that of Latin in European history, a prestigious language associated with learning, tradition, and the transmission of knowledge, even after it ceased to be a native spoken language. The comparison with Latin, therefore, highlights not a grammatical parallel, but Tolkien's broader conception of language as a carrier of cultural and historical continuity. Quenya is not only a linguistic system, but also a repository of the tradition, preserved in text and transmitted across generations as a language of elevated register and cultural memory. Taken together, these different influences show that Quenya cannot be explained through reference to a single linguistic source. Finnish contributed important elements to Tolkien's early linguistic imagination, especially at the phonological level and through selected morphological features. Indo-European linguistics provided a conceptual framework for the organization of verbal stems and aspectual categories. Greek offered a particularly important model for understanding verbal aspect, while Latin contributed primarily to the cultural and historical role assigned to Quenya. The significance of these parallels does not lie in direct imitation. Tolkien did not copy existing languages. Rather, he transformed linguistic tradition into a new and coherent system. His knowledge of languages allowed him to create not merely a vocabulary or an artificial code, but a language with internal history, development, and relationships between different stages. The evolution of the Quenya verbal system, therefore, reveals one of the central characteristics of Tolkien linguistic creation. It was conceived according to the principle of historical linguistics. Forms were not invented independently, but were connected to early stages, explained through internal development, and continuously revised according to a changing understanding of the language. For this reason, Quenya can be considered not simply an invented language, but a philological creation. It represents Tolkien's attempt to apply the methods and ideas of historical linguistics to a language of his own invention, creating a system that combines aesthetic beauty, structural coherence, and historical depth. In this sense, the study of Quenya provides a particularly revealing example of how linguistic knowledge can shape literary creation. Tolkien's languages demonstrate that invention and philology are not opposing activities. Through Quenya, they become two aspects of the same creative process. To conclude, I would like to end with a quotation from letter 163. My interest in languages was derived solely from my mother, a Suffield, a family coming from Invention in Worcestershire. She knew German and gave me my first lesson in it. She was also interested in etymology and aroused my interest in it, and also in alphabets and writings. The study I presented today is based on my master thesis, which I recently submitted and which I dedicated to my mother in connection with this very passage from Tolkien. This is not intended as a sentimental conclusion, but rather as a way of explaining the personal background of this research. It has always been clear to me how fundamental Tolkien's passion for languages was as the starting point of his entire intellectual and creative work, and how this passion was itself rooted in his early family environment, particularly through his mother. In a similar way, my own path into this topic did not begin from a purely academic interest, but from a more everyday and shared experience, a passion for languages that was transmitted with the family and gradually became central to my studies. What connects me to Tolkien in this respect is precisely this idea that a linguistic passion can emerge from everyday life, be shaped through personal relationships, and eventually develop into something intellectually and professionally meaningful. I am therefore here today not as an expert in either linguistics or Tolkien fictional languages, but as someone who has followed a path in which language itself and the way it is passed on and shared has always been at the center. In this sense, I am deeply grateful to have had the opportunity to explore this topic here. For this reason, I would like to conclude by expressing my gratitude. First of all, I would like to thank Beppe for giving me the opportunity to come here to Oxford to work on my thesis, and for the incredible support and help that has provided throughout this experience. I'm also deeply grateful to my supervisor in Italy, Professor Dede, for his constant guidance and support during the entire development of this work. Thank you.